handcuffs for almost an hour while agents tore apart his car.
They found no contraband.
What question did I not answer?
Rick Rainerson says it's wrong that he's asked where he's going in his own country.
Roll down your window. Is that as far as it'll go?
I bet the Border Patrol agents would say, come on, this is hardly a threat to your liberty. Just tell us where you're going. I answered 17 questions. I produced a military ID, a driver's license, 2 passports. So if it was your job to be a border guard and somebody wouldn't answer questions, wouldn't you want to detain them?
Well, you might want to, but unless you have reasonable suspicion for a crime,
I'm suspicious because you won't answer questions.
lack of cooperation cannot be used as a basis for reasonable suspicion. This is a person who's having to stop in the middle of a road, who's done nothing wrong, and finds himself surrounded by armed government agents with dogs.
The Border Patrol would not respond to our questions about this, so Congressman Peter King defended the agency.
I think of Border Patrol as Border Patrol. These are inland.
If there's reasonable course to do it, you can do it. I mean, we do have, remember, when people come into this country illegally, they don't stay on the border. They keep going.
If people aren't immediately compliant, they'll break a window. People have been tased.
I am not aware of any significant abuses at all. I'm on the Homeland Security Committee. If anything, the police we get is there's not enough strict enforcement.
Isn't there something un-American about 100 miles from the border, American citizens having to prove they're Americans just to drive to work or the grocery store?
We live in a very upsetting world. You always have to balance the equities.
Americans have the right to be free in their own country, to drive within their own country. Real freedom lies in the thin space that separates an American citizen from an armed member of their government.
I don't like Donald Trump. I used to. I found him spontaneous, real, entertaining, but now I realize he's a mean bully. I know this partly because I saw the video of Trump mocking a disabled reporter.
You gotta see this guy. Oh, I don't know what I said. Oh, I don't remember.
Trump's opponents quickly made this ad based on that video.
When I saw Donald Trump mock a disabled person, I was just shocked.
You gotta see this guy. I don't know what I said. Oh, I don't remember.
When I saw Donald Trump mock someone with a disability, it showed me his soul, his heart. And I didn't like what I saw.
Me neither. How cruel Trump was. The reporter has a disease and Trump mocks him. But wait a second. Trump waves his arms around. The reporter's disability means he can't move his arms. Also, Trump did something similar when mocking a general who said something he didn't like.
What do you think about ISIS? Oh, ISIS is very tough.
Trump also used the same motion to mock Ted Cruz.
They said, Senator Cruz, what do you think of waterboarding? Oh, I don't want to talk about it. He didn't want to talk about waterboarding.
Turns out this is a Trump performance gimmick. It's not very nice, but it doesn't appear directed at a disabled person. But I didn't know this until I started researching this show. I'm a media junkie, but I never saw the other side of the story. The media really didn't cover it. Another reason I don't like Trump is that he supported the Iraq War and then lied about that. I read that in the elite media again and again. They said Trump voiced his support for the Iraq War on the Howard Stern show. But here's how Trump actually answered Stern's question.
Are you for invading Iraq?
Yeah, I guess so.
I guess so. It's hardly a pushing for war. Later, as the drumbeat built for Bush to go into Iraq, Trump said this to Neil Cavuto.
Perhaps he shouldn't be doing it yet. And perhaps we should be waiting for the United Nations.
I wouldn't call that gung-ho support like so many commentators have said. Yeah, researching this show, I was surprised. The ruling class totally distorted that story. And by ruling class, I mean Hollywood, the political class, the media, so-called American elites. They said Trump was a disability or that he mocked a disabled reporter. You can't get the other side of the story. You know, it's dumb. Makes me wonder what else I don't know. No constant cover for me for the Washington, D.C. newspaper Hill. So what else do I know? I mean, Trump lied, I really believed, about his support for Iraq.
John, I would argue that that was the first time he was ever even presented that question. is a businessman at the time. Howard's interviews, if you listen to Stern, can go on for 90 minutes without a commercial. He'll just bring up anything. Before the war, yeah, I guess so. You don't hear that side of it.
Why not? Why doesn't the media pick up? Just because they hate Trump so much and they want to embarrass him?
There's a visceral hate for Trump.
The Center for Public Integrity looked at donations from 430 journals. 96%.
96%? Wow, I thought it was...
And your own newspaper and ABC, NBC, CBS coverage on one Thursday this month. They spent 23 minutes on the Trump sex allegations. Then there were the WikiLeaks email dump, which included derogatory comments about Catholics, Latinos, blatant examples of media collusion. Got just 1 minute 7 seconds.
So the ratio is therefore 23 to 1. In the New York Times, John, the same day, there were 11 stories on Donald Trump, including one in the sports section, all deemed negative. 0 on Hillary Clinton. So 23 to 1, 11 to 0. I get that Trump's going to get more coverage. I get that he rates more, he gets you more clicks. Give me 2 to 1, and I won't complain about it. 11 to 0?
But I'll push back.
Okay.
Groping. It's just going to bring in more eyeballs.
Sizzle always beats steak. Sex always beats substance.
So
I get that.
What the public wants to hear about.
23 to 1 hear about, though? In other words, you do this show, right? You have 6 blocks, A through F. You want to give me A and B for Trump and then C and D to Hillary? Would that be so hard? No, it's all Trump.
Other wiki points, there was interesting stuff that could have covered more. Donna Brazil giving Clinton debate questions ahead of time. It was covered, but it wasn't big.
Brazil barely got covered, relatively, in my opinion. Remember in the email, John, subject header said, from time to time I get debate questions, meaning it happened more than once.
Political reporter wrote yesterday, because I become a hack, I will send you the whole section that pertains to you. Please don't share or tell anyone I did this. He's sending his story for approval to Podesta.
Yes. In other words, if I'm a reporter, John, and you've reported before, you can fact check. You can send John Podesta questions saying, I have a question about this in terms of the money you raised here. A separate question. No problem with that. It happens all the time. He sent the entire text that pertained to Podesta. The publication, Politico, never offered an apology.
They're the ruling class. They mean well.
They mean well, but that's why it keeps getting worse.
The Clinton campaign told the New York Times which quotes they wanted clipped.
That is called quote approval. In 2012, Margaret Sullivan, she's the public editor, she's basically the watchdog for the paper. She said, this practice is banned. So what happened to the reporter? Nothing. The editor there wasn't even an apology about it. And that's the thing, it's not even being acknowledged, and there is no contrition as well, which would go a long way with the reader saying, I know I did this, I shouldn't have, I'm sorry.
All right, now, and of course the New York Times leans left. I wouldn't read it except as a news person, I think.
You think it leans left? I know the last time they endorsed a Republican candidate, 1956.
Totally, they are. Every day they do several less about run a two-quick spread and say, Hillary's scandals and lies? They could. Just before she became First Lady of Arkansas, she started trading in cattle futures. She turned $1,000 into $6,000 overnight. After 10 months, she had $100,000. But she said, I never received it. Then Travelgate, white letters, dodging sniper fire in Bosnia. The video showed there was no sniper fire. In fact, she posed for photographs. She just lied. Lies and scandals go on and on. The Times can easily fill 2 pages with them, but they don't. Instead, they zero in on Trump, running stories like this one. During the second debate, Trump was stalking Ray. Lots of media ran stories saying Trump was loomed over trying to invade her space. They quickly went on TV to complain about that.
He was really trying to dominate, and then he really stalked me around the stage, and I would just feel this presence behind me. And I thought, whoa, this is really weird.
I believe that. Watch the video. Walk over to Trump's side instead. The deceitful media could portray him as looming over Aren't they ashamed?
It's video evidence that you just laid out. But the headline rules the day, and no one's going to go back and watch that part of the video.
What happens if you wear what? So the New York Times says it's an emblem of hope. Philadelphia Inquirer. Soft. And then Melania's wife at the Republican. And she says, another reminder that right is always right. A scary state.
That was written by the same writer in the same publication.
We called her up. She did cancel it. Given the many things Trump has said about people who live in this country, that's what the press said to me.
I was about to say that, it's two words with a hyphen, self-awareness. Look at your archive, and because that was called out, then that was actually covered a little bit, and she is now a mockery.
Many in the elite media also accused Trump of threatening when he said that he was anti-sexual.
It's not the first time that he's been accused of inciting violence.
Here's what Trump actually said about Hillary being
see it as their mission to keep Donald Trump out of office because they're a danger to this country. Therefore, they're no longer journalists; they are activists.
This is what else mainstream media has mostly ignored. James O'Keefe's undercover team reports that the DNC funded goons who tried to provoke violence at Trump rallies.
Nobody's really supposed to know about me. So the Chicago protest, shut all of that was us. Ignore him. None of this is supposed to come back to us. We don't want it to.
If you didn't watch Fox, you might not know about this. CNN did run it once, as far as I know. Other networks have run it probably once.
But it's not being covered because it's an inconvenient narrative. The narrative
Trump campaign.
Remember the apocalypse that I mentioned earlier in the segment? That's what we'll be seeing as well. The Week magazine has a cover story this week about what happens if Trump loses. And on the cover is about 100 white people brandishing AR-15s, pitchforks, fire torches, and they're going to burn down the country if Trump loses. Remember where that narrative came from. Trump people are violent because we saw violence over the summer at these rallies. It turns out hear about that.
Thank you, Joe. These young people say Jordan Peterson should not be allowed to speak on their campus. Peterson's a psychology professor at the University of Toronto. When Canada proposed a law declaring it illegal not to call someone by their preferred pronoun, in other words, illegal not to address those who don't want to be called he or she, as say Z or Zim, Peterson said he would not obey that law.
Shame on you! Shame, shame, shame on you!
It's not just students who object. Hundreds of his colleagues signed a petition demanding Peterson be fired. They say his behavior is a danger.
This is where we draw the line! This is where we draw the line!
Now, when he tries to speak, protesters often surround him, blowing air horns or screaming to make sure others cannot hear him. At this school, he and students who wanted to hear him moved outside to escape the noise. But the protesters just followed him and drowned him again. Somebody wants to be called Z or Zer. Why not?
I don't care what people want to be called, that's fine, but that doesn't mean I should be compelled by law to call them that. The government has absolutely no business whatsoever, ever, governing the content of your voluntary speech.
But if I personally said I'd like you to call me Z or Zen,
we could have a conversation about that, just like I would if you asked me to use a nickname, for example. But there's a big difference between privately negotiated modes of address and legislatively demanded compelled speech.
Protesters call Peterson all sorts of names.
They've called me lots of things. Hitler, that was one. The fact that it has to do with transgender people is virtually irrelevant. The issue is compelled speech.
Peterson handles the protesters well. And you look pretty calm while they're screaming at you.
Yeah, well, you know, better to be calm.
Best to let the unreasonable opposition speak, because they manifest themselves as unreasonable, and then everyone can see it.
You can also see it in this video, viewed millions of times. Maybe because Peterson stays calm while the TV host keeps twisting his words.
You're saying that women aren't intelligent enough to run these top companies?
No, I didn't say that at all.
He simply says that natural differences explain most of the gender wage gap.
Do you believe in equal pay?
Well, I made the argument there, so it depends.
So you don't believe in equal
pay? No, I'm not saying that at all.
Like many on the left, she insists that difference proves discrimination. If it weren't for our sexist society, we'd be much more alike.
That's actually not the case. The science on that is absolutely clear. They've studied tens of thousands of people in dozens of countries, and the papers have been cited thousands of times.
For years, many leftists denied there were any differences. Aren't women in general better nurturers?
No. Next question.
Feminist icon Gloria Steinem even objected to research of it.
It's really the remnant of anti-American crazy thinking to do this kind of research.
But more research has been done, and it shows that on average, men and women excel at different things.
That runs contrary to the desires of the researchers who generated the data, because no one wanted that. It came as a shock to everyone, but that's how it is.
And yet when you say this, it infuriates them.
No, it should infuriate them, because I'm going right after the heart of the radical leftist doctrine.
The heart of that doctrine is that all groups should have equal outcomes. There should be just as many female CEOs, scientists, computer programmers, because men and women are the same. If outcomes differ, it must be sexism. Or, as actress Ashley Judd puts it,
the problem is the patriarchy.
The patriarchy. Professors teach exactly that.
The United States is a patriarchal society.
First of all, I think the idea that men tyrannically dominated everything is a pretty damn weak argument. The year 2000 to the year 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world fell by 50%. It's like, that's pretty good for a patriarchal tyranny. That was the fastest economic development in the history of the world.
But on campus, the message is inequality, oppression. Students major now in social justice.
Disciplines like women's and ethnic studies, which are corrupt right to the core.
I pledge to use they and them when I do not know someone's pronouns.
They're out to produce radical leftist activists by their own admission. All you have to do is go to the websites of these disciplines and look at how they advertise.
Social justice is different from justice. Social justice generally is justice for groups of people. It asserts every group, women, blacks, whites, should have the same income, job preference, everything. Peterson says this is an idea that comes from Marxist professors. It's a little discredited now to say I'm a Marxist.
Yeah, you'd think so, wouldn't you? Except I think it's 1 in 5 social scientists identify as Marxist. So yeah, it's a little discreditable, but it's nowhere near discredited enough. It should be as discreditable to say that you're a Marxist as it is to say that you're a Nazi.
It is. On campus, socialism is cherished, says Peterson, although it's murder.
We've got 100 million corpses stacked up to demonstrate.
Murderous then, but they say those Stalin, the bad individuals, doesn't mean
yeah, so was Mao, so was Pol Pot. The thing is that it was tried everywhere, and the end consequence was always the same. I've heard this all many, many times. That wasn't real communism. You know what that means? That means that if I would have been the benevolent dictator in the place of Stalin, then I would have brought in the utopia. There isn't a more narcissistic and toxic and inexcusable statement that you can possibly make.
We actually value the individual.
Peterson offers an alternative. Videos that suddenly are being viewed by millions.
The individual has intrinsic value.
Peterson calls for the opposite of Marxism, individual sovereignty.
The free market principle, the idea of individual sovereignty above all else, has distributed itself across the world quite effectively, and everyone is doing better here than anybody has ever done on the face of the planet throughout recorded history, and the whole West is like that. And to call that all a tyrannical patriarchy is indicative of a very deep resentment and a historical ignorance that's so profound that it's indistinguishable from willful blindness.
Peterson says the best thing people can do to fight back against that blindness is to speak the truth, even when it's unpopular. Peterson follows his own advice. He says unpopular truths, and people like that. Almost 1 million have bought his book.
Peterson, do you have any comments on the Nazi presence at your protest? The presence of Nazis and white supremacists assaulting people at your protest. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, I don't like Nazis.
Pronoun misuse may become actionable through the human rights tribunals and the courts, and the remedies, monetary damages, non-financial remedies, for example, ceasing the discriminatory practice or reinstatement to the job, and public interest remedies, for example, changing hiring practices or developing non-discriminatory policies and procedures. Jail time is not one of them. Jordan, you're not going to go to jail if you keep this up. Do you find that reassuring?
What if I don't pay the fine?
Then what?
Those are the sorts of problems that trans people face every day, being out of housing, being considered, considering suicide. These are really big problems.
My refusal to use pronouns because left-wing activists want me to use them has nothing to do with whether or not trans people are having difficulties in society. And I'd also like to point out that I've had many letters of support.
Problem, isn't it?
I've had many letters of support from trans people, and they tell me that the trans activists don't support them, and most trans people actually wanted to be referred to as he or she.
Doesn't mean
they
that
weren't
you
my
are
friends.
Untransphobic.
They
just
weren't
because
my
you
friends.
know a few people, just because you've talked
I
to a
didn't
few
know
trans
them.
people, you don't know the trans community like the trans community does. You've got no idea what it's like.
Professor Pete, I'm sorry to interrupt. Let's let Professor Peterson finish his thought, please.
All right, so the trans activists aren't proper representatives of the trans community because they haven't been elected by the trans community. They're noisy. I'm not speaking for anyone except myself, and on behalf of other people, perhaps who want to maintain the right to free speech. I'm not claiming that I'm a representative of white people or white men or any other group. I'm speaking on behalf of myself, and so I'm not taking.
But Professor Peterson, let me jump in there though, because we have seen an evolution of language. There are words that we don't use
not
anymore
by legislation.
Well, legislation or not, there are words that have evolved. We don't use, for example, I'm Asian. I would bristle if someone called me Oriental. That is an evolution of how we use words. How is this different, whether legislated or not? I understand I understand legislatively, but if at the heart of it is to allow a student to study free of what they feel is discrimination, why not help that along?
I already made my case for why not help that along. I believe that this legislation is extraordinarily dangerous, and there's other elements of it too that we haven't even got to in our society yet, like the protection for gender expression. And I've looked at gender expression in the Ontario Human Rights Code, and as far as I can tell, gender expression is best summarized in a single word: fashion.
Can someone please explain to Jordan B. Peterson that there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom from consequence? Do you agree there's a difference?
Well, certainly there's a difference.
And are you prepared to suffer the consequences that society may deem you need to suffer because of your views?
Yes, I'm prepared to do that.
What does that entail?
Are you open to learning?
Well, hang on.
That's not the question.
Hang on, that wasn't the question. That's right.
Well, so what am I willing to do? Well, I think that the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal is probably obligated by their own tangled web to bring me in front of it. If they find me, I won't pay it. If they put me in jail, I'll go on a hunger strike. I'm not doing this, and that's that. I'm not using the words that other people require me to use, especially if they're made up by radical left-wing ideologues. Now, if our society comes to some sort of consensus over the next while about how we'll solve the pronoun problem, let's call it, and that becomes part of popular parlance, and it seems to solve the problem properly without sacrificing the distinction between singular and plural, and without requiring me to memorize an impossible list of an indefinite number of pronouns, then I would be willing to reconsider my position. But I'm also partly opposed to this because it's been made mandatory and has the whole weight of the law behind it. It's like, this is a very bad idea. I believe this is a very bad idea. And I believe that the reason this has caused so much noise, tremendous amount of noise, tremendous amount of attention on YouTube, is because there are things that are at stake in this discussion, despite its surface nature, that strike at the very heart of our civilization.
When people talk about common ground, it's got to be founded on some kind of truth. And when we have feminists saying, I don't believe in the biological differences between men and women, well, that's why it's controversial. Where do you go from there? That's why it's controversial to say what you're saying, and it's controversial to say, hold on a second, maybe a girl on testosterone therapy winning high school wrestling meets is a problem. That's controversial.
Yeah, maybe that's a bad idea. It's just possible that that's not a very good idea. You know, I mean, it's hard to imagine that that could be the case. But, well, in this idea that I don't believe in the biological differences between men and women, it's like, well, what do you mean by believe? Exactly. It's like, you act out your belief. You know, I mean, what the hell does that mean? And what do you mean, see, what do you mean by belief? What do you mean by biology? And what do you mean by gender? Like, as soon as you put those three concepts together in a sentence that says, I don't believe in the biological difference between the genders, you throw the meaning of all three of those words up into the air so far that no one can tell what you're talking about, including you.
Yeah, and that's the goal, though, I think, a lot of the time. I think
Definitely. The goal, part of the goal, is an all-out assault on the categorical structure.
Do you think a trans woman is a real woman?
I don't really like the way those questions are formulated. Now, I don't know what that means. What do you mean a real woman?
Well, I'm asking you, in your mind, you know, it depends what you think a real woman is, but do you think a trans woman is a woman?
No.
Why not?
Because I think that women are capable, generally speaking, of having babies, and they have female genitalia, and they have an XX chromosome, and I think the biological markers are relevant. It doesn't necessarily mean that I don't think that people should be treated with respect and dignity if they happen not to fit easily into a gender category. That's a different issue.
Right.
But it's a matter of definition, and I actually think it's a foolish argument in some sense, because what do you mean by real?
Well, I mean, you've just clarified that, though. You don't think that a trans woman is a woman, and do you think that that is what is behind or explains your opposition to this idea of a law mandating you to use a preferred pronoun, is because you don't actually believe that that's the truth, that a trans woman is.
No, that's not my argument at all. Yeah, really. My argument is that the government shouldn't compel voluntary speech.
No, but I know what your argument is. And
no,
you've
but
made
that's
it very
really
clearly.
But that's exactly it.
But the motivation behind it.
There's no motivation behind it.
But you don't believe
I wouldn't
trans
put
woman is a woman.
everything online in my life to take the stance I did unless I had thought that through very deeply. And I've thought it through very deeply. There aren't hidden motivations that have to do with some arbitrary prejudice against trans people.
Okay.
It's pure and simply this. There's never been a time in English common law history where the government compelled speech, and the Canadian government dared to do that, and that was unacceptable. And they masked it with this show of compassion for the oppressed, and I don't buy it. I mean, and I've spoken with no shortage of trans people, and you know, my proclivity has been, without exception so far, to address them in the manner that seems most socially appropriate under the circumstances. Now, you asked
specific question, which was, do I have special expertise that I might share with other people?
You're doing Martin Luther, and I think that these issues are a little subtler than those. And so,
well,
I'm
what
just
makes
waiting.
you think that you're doing the kids that are grandstanding any favors by going along with their
Because
manipulation?
I can't decide which ones those are.
Well,
I just have my gut instincts, and that's not good enough.
Look, fair enough, but you have a type 1 and type 2 error problem. So one error is that you don't call students what they deserve to be called. That's one error. And the other error is that you call students what they want to be called even though they don't deserve it. And so what you're trying to do optimally is to minimize both those errors. To do that, you have to take a middle route. Now what you've decided to do, and I'm not criticizing you, is you've decided to allow for the possibility 100% of one of those errors because you think it's a less significant error. And you might be right, but it's not like you're acting in an error-free manner. You just decided to minimize one form of error at the expense of the other. Because I would say you're allowing, what would you call it, attention-seeking and somewhat narcissistic undergraduates to gain the upper hand over you in your class.
Well, it's not an essentially bad idea.
It's a terrible
challenge the tyranny of the patriarchy and the West.
It is an absolutely terrible idea when you assume that the fundamental reality of the West is patriarchal tyranny. It's like compared to what exactly? Our societies are more free and more productive than any other societies in the world, and than any other societies that have ever existed. Now that doesn't mean they're without their faults.
But if you look and you say, look at the facts, and you look at who's in power,
and who is in power? What exactly do you mean by that? Let's say
political power. Mainly men.
It depends on the domain. It's certainly not the case in anything that has to do with the provision of health. It's not the case in education.
No, but say political.
At the very upper echelons. Yes. At the very upper echelons. Yes. Political politics are dominated by men. What's the point? Is that making a patriarchal tyranny?
It's a patriarchal to a certain extent.
Well, and so when women participate in that patriarchal process, is that also a patriarchy? So when we have a healthcare system that's dominated by women, as we do now, is that a patriarchy?
No.
Why not?
I wouldn't call it a patriarchy.
Because it involves men.
Yeah.
Isn't it the structure that's patriarchal, or is it the gender that makes the difference?
You think it's the structure?
No, I don't buy the whole patriarchy idea or the tyranny idea. I think it's absolutely appalling. The idea that we have a hierarchical structure in the West is true. The idea that hierarchies tend towards corruption and deception and stultification across time is true. It's certainly the case that we need to be awake and criticize our institutions, but that is not the same thing as calling the West patriarchal tyranny. And words matter, especially among academics, who should be very, very careful with their words and who aren't.
We need a question.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, like I said, you're doing fine, but it's just too much. Like, I can't keep it straight.
Do you think that your behavior risks politicizing it, and do you think that politicization is justified?
I think my behavior risks politicizing it, yes. I would rather it not be politicized. And I'm doing what I can to manage that risk. However, it's become political in my country because the government implemented compelled speech legislation. So I wasn't complaining about that before it became political. Now, there is a time, even when you're detached in some sense from the political realm, that you can't be detached anymore. Well, I'm not happy with the fact that this has become politicized. You could say that I haven't done a stellar job in ensuring in every possible manner that this has remained neutrally apolitical. Probably true, but I'm not particularly unhappy with the way things have gone so far. And I'm not happy with the radical left. And so if they're irritated at me, so much the better, as far as I'm concerned. So have I conducted myself perfectly? Undoubtedly, no. So I've got more than my fair share of faults, and a temper is one of them. But I'm muddling through.
Why do you want to monetize?
Well, because I can do useful things with money, and partly because I'm curious, partly because I need to live, partly because my job was at risk for a long while, and that's not going to happen to me again, partly because I had to give up my clinical practice because of other considerations, partly because I have a family, partly because I want to
So
build
it
an
is
online
about
university.
raising. I mean, it's about raising money for a cause, or is it about raising money for you?
Well, I don't separate myself from what I'm doing, so I can't really answer that question. I mean, for me, what, am I going to buy a yacht? No. You know, like, I'm not a luxury kind of guy. I'm not looking to live the high life. I'm 55 years old, for God's sake. What would I do with that? You know, I have lots of things that I would do with some money. One of the things I want to do is build an online university, but it's not the only thing I want to do. And so I would put the money to good use, I suspect, or at least a reasonable use. And the reason that people are providing me with this money, which they don't have to do, is because they hope that I'll continue to do what I'm doing. And that is exactly the reason they're providing it with me. And my leftist critics have been saying for consistently, quite comical, well, look at all the money that Dr. Peterson is generating with his Patreon account. It's like, well, I'm not selling anything. All the stuff I do online is free. It's not even advertising supported. So if people want to support me on Patreon because they think that what I'm doing is helpful, then like more power to them as far as I'm concerned.
Well, first of all, if you don't have a purpose, it isn't that your life becomes neutral in a meaningless sense. It's that your life becomes characterized by unbearable suffering. Because the baseline condition of life is something like unbearable suffering.
So, 12 rules. Which one do you find the hardest to follow yourself?
Probably the hardest one is to tell the truth easily to lie. It's a constant challenge. It's easy to use your speech in a way that pays off in the short term, and it's difficult to contend with the conflict that's inevitable. Try to do things in a straightforward manner, because that produces short-term conflict. It produces long-term peace, which is a huge advantage, but it's very tempting in the short term to circumvent the problem and pretend that it's not there.
Do you sometimes avoid telling the truth just to be kind?
I try to be as kind as possible, but no. I'm tempted to, because I'm fundamentally an agreeable person, surprisingly enough. But I'm convinced that it's better to face things when they need to be faced and to get to the bottom of things, even though that's... And of course you have to be constituted in that manner if you're going to be a useful psychotherapist, because you can't let things go. They have to be dealt with, just like they have to be dealt with if you're a medical professional. It's unpleasant to tell someone that they have an illness. It hurts their feelings, it upsets them. But if you don't deal with it, then perhaps they die. And psychological issues can be of the same significance.
You talk sometimes about weak men. Why are weak men?
Well, weak people are a problem in general. And I don't mean physically weak, I mean cowardly, let's say, and deceitful, because I'm thinking it more in terms of moral weakness. Well, there's a variety of reasons. You can't support your own weight, let's say, and then someone else has to do it. And that's not good. And then if you don't pick a forthright and useful and noble pathway through life, then you will become bitter and too hurt by the tragedy of existence, and then you tend to seek your revenge wherever you can get it, and that's not good. So it's a mistake on all fronts. It's not good for you, it's not good for your family, it's not good for the community. It's certainly not a good medium to long-term strategy, because life is very, very difficult, and you have to be prepared for that. I had a watcher the other night. He was at my lecture in Oslo, and he wrote me a letter. He was a 17-year-old boy, and he said that my work had been very helpful to him. His father had died suddenly about 6 months before, and he found his dad when he was dying, and was very, very shocked and horrified and hurt by what had happened. And I had recommended on my YouTube lectures that one thing you could aim for was to be the strongest person at your father's funeral. And so that's what he did. And he helped his mom, and he wrote a 200-word eulogy and got through it. So good for him. That's strength and necessary. It's a terrible thing that happened, but he did everything he could not to make it any worse than it had to be.
But do you never see that showing weakness can be a strength?
Not weakness, vulnerability. That's a whole different thing. To admit to the fact that you're vulnerable, that's a form of courage. That's not a form of weakness. But that leads you to take whatever steps are necessary to deal with that problem. It isn't some facade that you're invulnerable. No one is invulnerable by any stretch of the imagination. And to stand up and face that is the best route that you have.
Why do you think so many young men, as you have,
because I want the best for them. Genuinely. I'm encouraging
more than you do for young women?
No.
So why do you think so many are young men?
Oh, well, I think part of it's technological fluke. I mean, I came to Providence at Eastern Park on YouTube, so I put my university lectures there, and it happens to be the case that 80% of the people who watch YouTube are young men. So there's that, and it's hard to know how to factor that in exactly. But then I think that young women are influenced a lot, which is fine as far as I'm concerned. But I think that's less true because we believe that there's something pernicious about male competence and activity. It's part of the notion that the best way to characterize Western society is as a tyrannical patriarchy, which is a appalling doctrine as far as I'm concerned.
How come that?
Well, it's not a tyrannical patriarchy. So it's not tyrannical, that's the first thing. Certainly not compared to any other governmental form that currently exists and has ever existed. And it's not essentially patriarchal unless you believe that women haven't contributed in immense part to the construction of what we have now. So, and I also don't believe that to the degree that it is patriarchal, that its structure is dependent on the expression of power, arbitrary power on the part of men. I think that happens sometimes, but only when things go wrong.
What you're doing and doing now as well is challenging the idea of gender equality, and it's very important in Scandinavia. I think it's as you probably know. Why do you think that can be a problem? The idea of gender equality.
I don't think that equality of opportunity is a problem. I think that's a great thing. Anyone with any sense champions equality of opportunity. I mean, even if you're purely selfish, say, and purely self-centered, you'd want to set up an economy where everyone who had ability could be maximally exploited by everyone else, because then we can all benefit from each other's talents. And so equality of opportunity is an absolutely useful fundamental principle. But that has nothing to do with equality of outcome. Those things aren't even in the same conceptual universe. And to strive for equality of outcome is, well, it's a fool's game and likely to be extraordinarily, it has proved to be in the past, extraordinarily dangerous as well as impossible. So, I mean, one of the things we know, for example, is that, I don't know to what degree it's common knowledge in Scandinavia, but the biggest differences between men and women in the world in terms of temperament and interest are in Scandinavia, and they've maximized as a consequence of your egalitarian policies. What do you mean by that? It means that the more egalitarian your state, the bigger the personality differences between men and women. That's like the...
How do you measure that? How do you know that?
Oh, well, psychologists have perfected, at least to some degree, the measure of personality over the last 30 years with very advanced statistical models. And so what you do is you offer men and women well-validated tests of preference and of personality, and you do that all across the world with tens of thousands of people in multi-country systems, and then you look at the difference between men and women, and then you rank order that by wealth and egalitarian social policy. And what you find is, the more egalitarian the society, the more different the men and women become.
Is this something you can do, or is it?
I would say, for me, it's quite a simple question, actually. Do we want to have sons and daughters have the same opportunities and the same dreams or hopes for the good thing or no? And for me, it's important to answer that. It's yes, of course. So for me, equality and gender equality is very, very important. For me, also when we talk about gender equality, it's important for me to learn my daughter that her mom can lead and show the way, and her dad can hug and kiss her and show feelings. And I think that's something very important for the hoods where kids grow up, to show feelings.